All right. Well, thank you for the songs this evening. Appreciate the opportunity to learn a new song. Appreciate Joe working with us patiently. Appreciate those songs so much that Brother Joe writes. All right. Let's see. We're going to Psalm number 92 as we continue our Bible study and through the start with our summary statement here, Psalm 92. Psalm 92 gives thanks for the mighty works of Yahweh, who destroys all enemies and delivers the righteous. So I'll go over that one more time. Psalm 92 gives thanks for the mighty works of Yahweh, who destroys all enemies and delivers the righteous. An outline for this psalm, I think the simple outline would be in 3 parts. Verses 1 to 5, thanksgiving and praise to Yahweh. Verses 6 to 11, the downfall of all enemies. Verses 12 to 15, the blessings of the righteous. So I'll go over that one more time. Verses 1 to 5, thanksgiving and praise to Yahweh. Verses 6 to 11, the downfall of all enemies. Verses 12 to 15, the blessings of the righteous. Okay, so we'll go to our observations. Psalm 92 was written as a song for the Sabbath day. We see that in the superscription there. A psalm or song for the Sabbath day. Now, this heading on this psalm actually marks 2 unique occurrences in the entire book of Psalms. So one is, this is the only psalm that is superscribed to a day. That's the only time that occurs. And the second is that this is the only mention of the Sabbath in the entire Psalms, is here in the superscription of Psalm 92. There is no author indicated in the heading of the psalm or indicated in the text of the psalm. As always, we would call it an anonymous psalm. There's no clear indication or compelling reason to assume any particular author. I do think that there has been some historical suggestion of Moses as the author of this psalm, but really there's parts of this psalm that are just too late to make sense of Moses being the author. So I think it's a much later psalm than Moses. Probably even a psalm that's written possibly post-exile for Israel. So could have been by one of the scribes. We just don't really know. Now the word for psalm that's used in the heading Mismar is the word. It occurs. It's very common. It's 57 times in the Psalms, but it only occurs in the superscriptions of the Psalms. And that word means to sing with musical accompaniment or instrumental accompaniment. And then the word for song that is used indicates a lyrical song. So the singing of words, and that term also can include instrumental accompaniment as well. There's no other musical direction that is given in the superscription or in the text of the psalm. There's no occasion that is given for the psalm beyond just mentioning it's a song for the Sabbath day. The mention of the Sabbath doesn't really indicate anything about the text of the psalm, though, at least not the weekly Sabbath. It was probably used, and I think there is some record that it was used within Judaism. Um, much later after the times of the Bible and such, possibly in the Second Temple time as well, but that it was a part of a Sabbath day liturgy. But not really for sure when that started, or when that originated. The weekly Sabbath, though, the weekly Sabbath of rest was actually a figure of the true rest that was to come. And so that is made plain in places like Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 8 to 11, and much in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7 through chapter 4, verse number 11. In other words, the true rest for God's people is in that kingdom to come through Jesus Christ. And so this weekly Sabbath was a figure of that eschatological Sabbath or eschatological rest that is to come in the future kingdom of the Messiah. And that actually fits very well in the context of this whole psalm. So in this case, then, this we could look at this psalm as being written for a weekly reminder of the true and greater Sabbath to come. So most likely it could have been at least at a time where it was written for sort of a weekly use of some sort, though we're not sure of what that original use may have been. But it's written for that weekly use, but it's looking forward to a future time to come, the greater, the true Sabbath when it is fulfilled in the kingdom. Um, Psalm 92 would be categorized as a thanksgiving psalm. And as such, it certainly has elements of a praise psalm, as those two are often very closely associated. We have the praiseworthy acts and attributes of God that we get in this psalm. It also has elements of a wisdom psalm. We have mentions of fools and lack of understanding. We have a contrast between the righteous and the wicked and the different ends that they come to, sort of like, what is the end of their way? Um, the the um, the wicked flourish briefly, for a temporary time, during this life, and then the righteous are going to flourish forever, in God's courts. So we have that contrast. It also has some elements of a creation psalm, referring to natural things like the grass and the trees, referring to morning and night, those things that are marked as part of a creation, and also the mention of the work of God's hands, which typically refers to God's creative work. This psalm also has prophetic predictive elements to it. It looks forward to that future rest of the righteous and to the destruction of the wicked. And so when you get down in the latter part of the psalm, when it starts talking about what's going to happen to the enemies, you see, they shall be. It's what's going to happen to them and what's going to happen to the righteous. So it has this future orientation to it, and ultimately prophesies what is going to take place for both the righteous and the wicked. Psalm 92 also has close connections with the two previous Psalms, so Psalm number 90 and Psalm 91. There's a continued use of terms and imagery throughout these three Psalms. For instance, the name Most High, used of God, which isn't a real common name for God in the Psalms, more commonly used in the Pentateuch and some of those earlier writings. We get this combination of God's hesed and His faithfulness, and that is, that's brought out in these psalms. We get references to time in all these psalms. All of these psalms feature the blessings of long life and prosperity for the righteous that's envisioned. The mention of enemies and the overcoming of enemies. We also get some references, some imagery that pertain to the Exodus and to the wilderness wandering, and so that's going to give it some connections with Deuteronomy as well. Um, Particularly, you have a connection with Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse number 17, the mention of the horns of the unicorn and the blessing of Joseph that takes place there. So there is a strong connection there as well with Deuteronomy. The psalm also has some interesting connections with Psalm 1 and Psalm 2, and that obviously shouldn't surprise us with wisdom elements and such. But in Psalm 1 and 2, you get the contrast of the righteous and the wicked. You get the fruitful tree imagery of the righteous. You get the wicked blown away like the chaff. You get enemies opposing God and being destroyed by the coming of God's anointed. And so all of those things are here in Psalm 92 as well. Um, the poetic features of Psalm 92 would be the sort of the most obvious would be the structure of this psalm, and again, it's the sort of thing that doesn't come out as easily, except for those that are scholars in Old Testament Hebrew. But it's what is referred to as a ring structure or an envelope structure. There's a few different ways I've seen it referred to. So in verses 2 and 15, you get this use of this term show, this showing that uses the same word. So it sort of begins and ends the same way. A ring structure, it sort of encloses this poetry, and so the poetry unfolds sort of like one side of an X, and then they call it a chiastic structure after the Greek letter chi, which is shaped like our English letter X. So it sort of goes and then kind of comes back to where, and it sort of mirrors, sort of like a mirror image. So that happens. You get the ending that parallels the beginning in some way, and so that does happen in this psalm. So that's sort of an obvious feature in the composition of the psalm. And again, it's not that obvious when we just read it in English, but it is there. This psalm doesn't use a lot of imagery. It does use some. It seems to focus more on contrasts. And I'll give Steve, for him, another fancy word to use, juxtaposition. So he can work that in next time. I forget what word he used, a word Sunday. So we'll give him another word to use. Juxtaposition, setting two things alongside to compare and contrast. So you get these contrasts, right? So in the psalm, you get contrasts between God and the wicked. All right, so God is high, He is upright, He is wise, and He is eternal. The wicked, on the other hand, they'll be struck down. They're workers of iniquity. They're fools, and they are as temporary as the grass. Then you get another set of contrasts that come between the righteous and the wicked. So the wicked, again, they're like the grass, and the righteous are like trees. The wicked are temporary, the righteous are blessed with long life. The wicked will be destroyed, and the righteous will be established. They will be planted like these trees in the courts of God. Um, you do have some imagery. You get this reference to fools with the figure of a brute beast. It doesn't come out. What does it say in verse 6? It says a brutish man, but it's actually a word that would quite literally refer to a beast of the field. But it is used in reference to people, particularly when they are arrogant and stubborn. So you get that sort of an imagery. You get the imagery of the springing up of green grass, and the way that this is put, this is something that would be seen in a desert type place, and so you would get this quick springing up of green grass that stands out as a stark contrast of the dryness around it, but it doesn't last long. It very quickly is going to dry up and wither away. You get this imagery of the righteous being compared to being like palm trees and like cedar trees in God's temple and God's court, and being fruitful as in old age as though they are young. Okay, so let's go ahead and walk through this psalm, 15 verses. So I'll go ahead and read through it. It is a good thing to give thanks unto the Lord, and to sing praises unto thy name, O Most High, to show forth thy loving kindness in the morning and thy faithfulness every night. Upon an instrument of 10 strings, and upon the psaltery, upon the harp with a solemn sound. For thou, Lord, hast made me glad through thy work. I will triumph in the works of thy hands. O Lord, how great are thy works, and thy thoughts are very deep. A brutish man knoweth not, neither doth a fool understand this. When the wicked spring as the grass, and when all the workers of iniquity do flourish, it is that they shall be destroyed forever. But thou, Lord, art most high forevermore. For lo, thine enemies, O Lord, for lo, thine enemies shall perish. All the workers of iniquity shall be scattered. But my horn shalt thou exalt like the horn of a unicorn. I shall be anointed with fresh oil. Mine eye also shall see my desire on mine enemies, and mine ears shall hear my desire of the wicked that rise up against me. The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those that be planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bring forth fruit in an old age. They shall be fat and flourishing, to show that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. So, verses 1 to 2 open up this psalm with this call for thanksgiving, this call for praise of God. And we see the reference to loving kindness and faithfulness there in verse number 2. The word for loving kindness, of course, is hesed. It's translated in a number of different ways: loving kindness, mercy, steadfast love. There's a number of ways, and we've talked about it a number of times. As I understand it, the Hebrew word just doesn't really correspond one to one to an English term. And the word itself doesn't mean anything about covenant, but the word is oftentimes used in connection with God's covenant and his faithfulness, his loyalty, his mercy, his love, all of these things that come through covenant promise to those who take refuge in him. And especially when you see it joined with a word like faithfulness, which doesn't happen extremely often, this particular word that's used here. But they are covenantal terms, particularly when they're used together. We have usage back in Psalm 89, verses 1 and 2, and 24 and 33 and 49. And if you remember, Psalm 89 laments the downfall of the Davidic dynasty and that the Davidic covenant was unfulfilled. And so it has a lot of reference to the covenant and to the fact that God will not forsake his covenant, but he will fulfill it. But now, much like Psalm 90 and 91, this psalm confirms the hesed, the faithfulness of God to his covenant, meaning that his covenant is still secure. So, in a lot of ways, this psalm has a lot in common with Psalm 89. But Psalm 89 is more of a lament, and this psalm is more of a praise. So this psalm is not complaining of a crisis. This psalm is not complaining of how long that this crisis has taken place. This psalm rather is just a full expression of faith that ultimately God is still on his throne. And though circumstances be what they may, and in this case, exile, God is still faithful, and he will fulfill all of his word. Now, this expression of morning and night indicates a continual faithfulness, and it's the covenant mercy of Yahweh that is at all times, like it's unceasing. So, when you think about morning and night, sort of in poetic terms, well, it happens every day. Every day there's a morning, every day there's a night. That's just continual, ongoing. It seems like it's been that way forever, this way and forever that way. But that's how that we experience this creation that God has made. And remember that this is also God's covenant with Noah, and that he established these times and seasons and so on, and that he upholds them as long as the earth stands. Verses 3 to 5 then move into this more direct personal praise for God. We get three different types of instruments that are named, and they are instruments that were intended for the singing of the psalm. So that would be technically a musical direction if that is the case. It's not clear. These instruments are oftentimes mentioned: Psalm 33 and verse 2, Psalm 43 and verse 3, Psalm 49 and verse 4, Psalm 57 and verse 8, Psalm 71, verse 22, Psalm 81 and verse number 2. There's a number of times they'll be mentioned. Different instruments will be mentioned in the rest of the psalm as well. Typically in the psalm, we can find instruments that pertain to stringed instruments, that pertain to wind instruments, and that pertain to percussion instruments. And you can find all of those mentioned in the psalm. Now, the three that are mentioned here are all stringed instruments. We don't know exactly what is being referred to. Two of them seem to be sort of more portable handheld stringed instruments. One of them, at least, being something like a handheld harp. The other maybe being a harp, maybe being a larger stringed instrument, but we don't know for certain. Certainly, they were probably forerunners of ladder instruments like lutes and possibly even guitars and all these things as they have developed over time. The word for glad literally means to brighten up. And so, you think about someone when they experience a genuine smile, how their face just sort of brightens up, their posture and everything about the person just sort of brightens up. That's what this word means. It sometimes is translated rejoice, but what it indicates is being joyful all over, being joyful all the way through, you might say. It's the same word actually that's used in Psalm 16 and verse number 9, about the joy of the messianic hope of resurrection. So it's a lasting and a full joy that only comes from God. Now we get this repetition. We get a brief repetition here of works, and there's a couple places we do get some repetition. We get repetition of enemies, and then we get repetition of works, referring to God's works and the works of God's hands. The works of God's hands is usually a reference to His creation work. Usually, when it's just works or mighty works or marvelous works that we see sometimes that are mentioned more broadly, they usually refer to His acts of deliverance, His acts of salvation, much like in the Exodus. When it says that God's thoughts are very deep, and you see that there in verse 5, the word has the idea of being profound, being difficult, out of reach, and could even be secret. So, what it's describing then, it's describing the wisdom of God's works. It's a wisdom that is really it's beyond our depth. It's beyond our understanding to fully understand the wisdom of God's works. And that sets up this contrast because immediately in verses 6 to 7, we begin to get this description of the wicked. And of course, the first description we're going to meet with is going to be that of being foolish. So the word for brutish man, as it is here, it refers to a beast, and it is used figuratively to refer to a obstinate, foolish person. Um, it's when you think about the what's being said here. So animals are wondrous creations. There's just a seemingly endless diversity of types of animals and types of abilities and traits and things that they have, defense mechanisms and all these sort of things. Animals are wondrous creations in and of themselves, but they themselves do not realize or think about the beauty of the creation. Animals that and they do can do some of the most wondrous things, and these are instinctual. And I know that they can sort of learn some traits or some habits, or they can learn some certain actions and such, but they have these instincts. And the point is, though, they don't think about it. They don't think about how wonderfully that they are made. They don't sit there and observe other animals in the field and think about, oh, what a wondrous creator that we have, that the deer can run and jump like this, and the otter can swim in the water this way, and the rabbit can do this. I've sometimes have sat um, and just very still and quiet in the woods and just watching, and all of a sudden a rabbit takes off, and like it was so close to me and I did not even see it. Like it can stay so still and so hidden for so long. It's amazing to see these things, but they don't think that. The eagle that's soaring high in the sky doesn't think about the wonders of the creation of the rabbit. It just thinks about lunch. It spots a rabbit, it's going to swoop down, and there's wonder in that as well. So all these animals are wondrous creations by God, but they don't think so. They don't look around and think about that. So that's what's being said. Man's like a brute beast. He doesn't look around. The wicked are like brute beasts. They don't recognize God in the creation. They don't recognize the greatness of the works that God has made. They don't stand in awe of the Almighty Creator, but rather we're told that they are fools. And this word typically indicates a proud and stubborn person. He doesn't account for God and his knowledge in places like Psalm 14 and verse 1 and Psalm 49 and verse 10. And there's a few other references to that as well. This is the the most common word for fool actually in the book of Proverbs. And we get all kinds of different pictures of this fool in action. But ultimately, these fools just refuse wisdom and will not learn it. And it doesn't say anything about their intelligence. It's not saying that they're unintelligent, but rather there's a refusal. There's a refusal to look at the creation and to see the majesty of God in the great works that he has done. There's a refusal to learn wisdom from the word of God, the very source of wisdom, who has the depths of wisdom that we can never be able to fathom. A fool does not understand, and particularly what's talked about in this psalm, in verse 7. A fool doesn't understand the flourishing of the wicked. The flourishing of the wicked is like green grass in a dry place. It's a quick sprouting grass. It's unmistakably obvious. It looks so rich and luxuriant, especially against the backdrop of all the dryness. But obviously, it's very, very short lived. So the wicked do not understand that their success is only temporary and it's only leading them further down the road to destruction that will come surely. And that destruction is without remedy when it does come. Verses 8 to 9, we see how but God is above the wicked. Verse number 8 says, "But thou, Lord, art most high forevermore." And so when you're looking at the structure of this psalm, that verse right there is in the exact middle of the psalm, which typically in Hebrew poetry, especially, that middle is where the focus is. That's truly the center of this poem. So that's the center of this psalm. Thou, Lord, art most high forevermore. God is forevermore. Contrasted, obviously, with the green grass of the wicked that's very short lived. And that God is high forevermore is a reference to his universal kingship, like in Psalm 2 and verse number 4, where he sits in the heavens above the raging nations and laughs at the defiance of his enemies. The Lord's enemies, as we go on reading, are identified with the wicked, with workers of iniquity, with the brute beasts, and the fools. In other words, you have several different terms that are used, and they're all collected to describe God's enemies. And they all shall perish, just like is spoken of in Psalm 1 and verse number 6. The way of the ungodly shall perish. They will perish and they will be scattered. Now, this scattering does refer to a dispersing. It's not the same word that is used in Psalm 1 and verse number 4, the chaff being blown away by the wind, but it does give us very similar imagery. But it's actually a word that refers to the flight of a routed army. It's just all chaos and they're just dispersed and just fleeing. And we get that usage in Psalm 68 and verse number 1. Verses 10 and 11 then give us the simultaneous. So you've got the downfall of the wicked and you've got the exaltation of the righteous. So the uprising of the righteous, the downfall of the wicked, these are simultaneous in this psalm. And we have reference to the horn, which the horn is the symbol of, it's a symbol of strength in the Bible. The unicorn that's mentioned here, the horn of the unicorn, this is a creature that is not known to us exactly what is being referred to. Most likely, it was some sort of a wild ox type of animal that had a very tall horn, possibly even a single horn, and has gone extinct. But it was a reference in that time, and even in ancient literature outside the Bible, it was known and referred to and was known for strength and the use of its horn and all of that for dominance and so on. The language of exalting here is the language of lifting up to kingship in particular, and so we've seen that all the way back to Psalm 3 and verse 3 when David referred to God as being his glory, but his kavod, but he also referred to him as being the lifter of his head, and that's the same term here for exalt that is used. Psalm 9 verse 13, Psalm 18 verse 48, Psalm 27 verses 5 and 6 all those being messianic psalms. Psalm 75 and verse 7 and verse 10, Psalm 89 and verse number 19. And also, it's the language of being lifted up to inheritance, Psalm 37 and verse number 34. The anointing with oil indicates blessing. It also indicates kingship. Psalm 23 and verse 5, Psalm 45 and verse 7, Psalm 89 and verse 20. Now, this reference to seeing and hearing the destruction of the enemies, it's a statement of the completeness of victory. And it refers to eschatological victory. It's something of a theme. Psalm 54 and verse 7, Psalm 59 and verse 10. It's also in Psalm 91 and verse 8. It's also foreshadowed in the Exodus, back in Exodus chapter 14, verse 13, and verse number 30. So verses 12 to 15 finish out this psalm, and we get these blessings for the righteous. The palm tree and the cedar tree, what is it about them that's alike? I'll just ask that question and take a drink of water. No guesses on that? Well, the palm tree and the cedar tree are both evergreen trees. They're both evergreen. The palm is actually not a tree; it's more of a plant. But they only reach tree status if they get to 20 feet or above. But they are both evergreens. Cedars being coniferous, and palm trees are something I can't pronounce. They're not coniferous, but they are something along that line. But they're both evergreens. Their leaves stay green, and they don't shed their leaves annually like deciduous trees do. So that obviously is a good reason for the comparison of them. Palms are flowering and fruitful. They actually palm trees are perennial plants, but they are considered trees again when they reach that height. The cedars of Lebanon, in particular, were famously tall and stately trees, and these were trees that were used in the construction of the temple. And these are trees that are known to put down deep roots. These are trees that are known to be enduring, unlike the green grass that is just very temporary. And there's promise to be planted, to be rooted. That's the same promise you get in Psalm 1 and verse 3. It's also a promise that's echoed in Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse number 8. And it suggests permanence. It suggests longevity. And being planted in the presence of God is to the praise of His glory. In other words, it's a display of His glory. Psalm 84 verses 1 to 4, similar usage. Now in verse 14, it says that they'll be fat and flourishing, and that doesn't sound complimentary, I guess, to us today. But fat and flourishing actually would be a description of a young, healthy, fruitful, high yield, high producing trees. But notice what it said about them, that they would be that way in old age. So in old age, they would be like young and fruitful trees, which sounds contradictory. But it's a poetic way of expressing long and prosperous and vigorous life that the righteous will enjoy. And in fact, it echoes the same theme in Psalm 91 and Psalm 90. God as a rock is one of the common designations of God that's related to the covenantal theme of refuge. There's a number of different words that's used. This is one of them. The word indicates a rock wall, a stone tower. It could even be just a mountainside of rock that has maybe a cave or some sort of cleft in it. In other words, it's a way of referring to what's considered a strong and impenetrable fortification. So it speaks of safety and security. We've seen it used in Psalm 18, verse 2 and 31 and 46, Psalm 19 and verse 14, Psalm 27 and verse 5, Psalm 28 and verse 1, and on and on and on. It's used a lot of times in the Psalms. The deliverance of the righteous, it says, shows God's uprightness and righteousness. So when the righteous have been delivered in the way described in this psalm, that is going to show forth the righteousness, the uprightness of God. How so? Because that means God kept all of His promises and did not let a jot or a tittle of His word fail to come to pass. So when the righteous experience this blessing in the kingdom to come, that means that will show, that will be a display, that will be a witness, a demonstration of God's faithfulness, his righteousness. All right, let's go to interpretation. Psalm 92 teaches that there's true security in God alone. God is the rock. The presence of the enemies and the wilderness motif that's continued in this psalm show that this psalm is written in light of exile. It's written in light of unfulfilled promises. But it's not a lament. Rather, it's a psalm of praise because God's merciful and God's faithful to keep his word. And it will come to pass. And wisdom understands that because wisdom takes a longer view, whereas the wicked and the foolish, they only look at the short term view, the flourishing of the wicked that's just for a moment, like that green grass. It echoes the language of the wilderness exile. Obviously, it speaks to Israel in exile that's still in exile to this day. Despite any present flourishing of the wickedness, that flourishing will not last. God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to David and Israel, they will be fulfilled. Psalm 92 teaches that only God is ultimately satisfying. So the wicked are shown to us here as those they're easily satisfied with the things of present life. They're easily satisfied with their accomplishments and with the rewards that they get in this life. They're easily satisfied with the prosperity and the success that they meet with in this life. But they're fools because they don't understand that that is only very temporary and they're ultimately headed for destruction, of course, except they repent. Well, the righteous, rather, they hope in God and they take refuge in him as their rock. And this present life will pass by, and the righteous will experience different levels of success and prosperity in this life and have good things and have bad things and prosperity and adversity, and they come and they go. But the righteous understands that. It's very fleeting. It's very temporary. It's here today. It could be gone tomorrow. But their hope is in God. Their refuge is in him. He is their rock. Everlasting life in the presence of God awaits for those who trust him. The righteous understand that. The messianic hope of Psalm 92 is clearly seen in the latter part of this psalm in particular. So verses 10 and 11 show that the destruction of the enemies comes with the exalted horn of God's anointed. And this language echoes the language throughout the Psalms, the language of God's anointed who will break his enemies to pieces when he comes to Zion. That was introduced back in Psalm 2, verses 6 to 9. And again, it's echoed throughout. When you look at verses 12 to 14, they're describing a long and fruitful life. Like what we saw in Psalm 90, verses 14 to 17, like what we saw in Psalm 91 and verse 16. Well, this is the description of life in the kingdom when the Messiah comes. So listen to a passage like Isaiah chapter 65, verses 17 to 25. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former shall not be remembered nor come into mind. But be ye glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem a rejoicing, and her people a joy. And I will rejoice in Jerusalem and joy in my people, and the voice of weeping shall be no more heard in her, nor the voice of crying. There shall be no more thence an infant of days, nor an old man that hath not filled his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, but the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed. And they shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree are the days of my people, and mine elect shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain, nor bring forth for trouble, for they are the seed of the blessed of the Lord, and their offspring with them. And it shall come to pass that before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together, and the lion shall eat straw like the bullock, and the dust shall be the serpent's meat, and they shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountains, saith the Lord. Well, this is a description of life in the kingdom. There are those that will enter the kingdom in their mortal bodies. We know that when Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation time there in Revelation chapter 19, and as you go into Revelation chapter number 20, there are those that will enter in their mortal bodies, and there will be those of that have died and gone on before who will be resurrected and glorified to enter to that kingdom. But there will be those that enter in mortal bodies, and they will enjoy again long life. And those that trust in the Lord, they will enjoy long and fruitful and prosperous lives. It's described in a lot of different ways in the Bible. So that is what's pointed to here. They even into their old age, they're still going to be like the fruitful young trees, is what is being said. So, this is a description of life in the Messiah's kingdom, and ultimately where the hope of the righteous is. All right, applications. I have two of these. Number one, understanding Psalm 92 helps us understand life in this present age. The wicked prosper and flourish, but it's only in the short term. And that short term might be our lifetime. In other words, all of my lifetime might be spent seeing the flourishing and the prospering of the wicked all around us. And I have seen it. I've seen it as long as I've been able to recognize it. I continue to see it to this day. I imagine I will continue to see it as I continue living until the Lord returns. So we have to understand life in this present age. It's very easy to become just despondent, and to become depressed, and become and to be so agitated, and so and I had a time in my younger days that just was just so constantly agitated and aggravated, seeing the wicked in positions of power and seeing them flourish, even though just knowing they were corrupt people to the core, and just almost as if they were shaking their fist at God and just daring him to do something about it. And I used to be so aggravated, so agitated all the time about all those things. But that's really not how we are to understand this present life. Their prosperity is only temporary. No matter what, no matter how great it may seem, no matter how much they may even use their power to oppress the people of faith, it doesn't matter. It's only going to be temporary. And wisdom understands this. So Psalm 92 is one of those psalms that helps us understand life in this present age. Number two, understanding Psalm 92 helps us understand where true satisfaction is. We are so easily satisfied with temporary things of life in this world, but it's only God who gives full joy and full lasting satisfaction. It so a psalm like this provides us with a time to stop and to take some inventory of our own hearts, doesn't it? Do we have a true hunger for God and His Word and His people? And do we find that satisfying? Do we find other things more satisfying than that? Well, we could say by the fact that we have a lot of empty seats here tonight is an evidence that there are many that find things. They're within sight, they're within distance, they're within reach. They could be here tonight studying the Word of God, but they find a lot of things more satisfying than that. And again, it's a good test for our own heart. Do we find things in life more satisfying than God, His Word, His people? Has our satisfaction in these things maybe been dulled by the pursuit of other things for satisfaction in life? Have they sort of edged out that so that we're not finding that sort of satisfaction, that we don't maybe want to spend the time in God's word that maybe we at one time did when we found greater satisfaction in those things? Well, ultimately, I know that that's a battle against the flesh and the sin that still dwells within us as long as we're in this life. But it is a battle that we have to fight. It's a battle we have to fight to put to death. And so we do have to fight for that satisfaction. It's sort of like becoming a grown up, and when you realize that there are just certain consequences. Yeah, that jalapeno laden pizza at midnight sounds really good, but the grown up in me knows it's not worth it. It's not worth it if I eat that. It's not going to, the effects are not going to be good. So it's sort of that way. Like we have to grow up, and we have to understand that yes, there are some temporary things of life that might provide us with some temporary satisfaction, but at what cost? At what cost? Are we dulling our satisfaction in the things of the Lord to spend it on these other things that ultimately don't satisfy, and at least certainly not long term? All right, so that's our study for Psalm 92. Any questions about this psalm here this evening? All right, well, we will be dismissed with prayer. Almighty Father in heaven, Lord, thank you for the day that you've given us, and thank you for your word. And Father, I just pray that you would work in each of our hearts and lives to think about those things that are truly the priorities, those things that we need to be putting our time and attention and resources into, um, and help us, Father, to truly be satisfied in you and your word, no matter what the present life may bring or may take away. Father, I pray that you would be with us as we go to our homes, that you'd be with us throughout the rest of this week. Help us to live in light of your grace and to be faithful testimonies of your truth. Father, I pray that we'd be good witnesses. Father, I pray you'd prepare hearts and minds for services on the coming Lord's Day. All these things I pray in the holy and precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen.